Welcome to Bake to the Future. The wholesale baking industry mixes tradition and innovation to feed the world and the economy, generating some major dough while employing nearly 800,000 people in the U.S. We bring you a fresh take on the latest trends and issues impacting the baking sector through exclusive insights and conversations. Brought to you by the American Bakers Association, who will take you Bake to the Future.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Haley Blumenreich.
And I'm Katie Jewell.
And this is a special episode of Baked to the Future. Yes, we are talking about cannabis and baked goods. In 2020, 5 states legalized recreational use of cannabis, making that a total of 15 states where recreational use is permitted. Meanwhile, there are still 14 states where cannabis is illegal, as well as on the federal level. And as cannabis is legalized to sell in states across the U.S., this is an ever quickly growing industry. There is so much to hash out with this topic, from the market potential to the regulatory and supply chain challenges to the trends in cannabis-infused baked goods and more. And we're really excited to unpack it today with a few of our guests, and hopefully they will help us understand the scope of the industry and where the potential is for wholesale baking companies. So to help us understand the scope, we have Doug Peckinpah. He's the chief editor of Snack Food and Wholesale Bakery and editor of Cannabis Products Magazine. Welcome, Doug.
Hello. Nice to be here today.
And I promise everyone that we're going to get our puns out of our system early. This will be a grown-up discussion, but we just felt like it was a good opportunity to kind of use these things. And also with us to bring her in-depth, on-the-ground perspective is Rebecca Maestas, brand development manager at Live Well in Colorado. She's responsible for 8 brands that the company manufactures and distributes through both Live Well retail as well as third-party retailers. Those brands make products such as chocolates, gummies, creams, oils, drinks, and baked goods. Before her current role, Rebecca was with Dixie Brands, which was one of the first cannabis-infused product manufacturers to enter the space in Colorado when the industry was budding in 2008-2009. She was a real trailblazer, helping Dixie grow from one market in Colorado to 6 states with an IPO in late 2018. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Later in the show, we will be getting more in the weeds with ABA's Vice President of Regulatory and Technical Services, Rasmus Voners, about the regulatory outlook at the state and federal level and some things that companies should consider when getting into the business and more.
So, like I said, it will be a very grown-up conversation. I am looking forward to learning more things, and I hope everyone, including myself, comes away knowing something that they didn't know before about this industry. But first, we have a few hardball questions. I think that we're going to start with Rebecca. Rebecca, what is your favorite baked good?
Favorite baked good is actually the traditional pot brownie.
All right. So, if you had no other choices, you're like, you know what, pot brownie, that's it.
Yeah. Let's see. Probably the second runner-up for me would be, we have these seasonal pies that are really amazing.
Nice. So you're a company girl. I like it. Doug, what about you?
You know, while brownies are considered a bar cookie, I like a drop cookie or a wire cut cookie. So, you know, I'm very cookie oriented, just in general in life. So I always gravitate toward the classic chocolate chip.
And I just love it how folks in the industry are so specific sometimes, about the drop cookie and the sheet cookie, and we can talk about laminating and sheeting and sandwich cookies and everything else. So, all right, well, thank you for your insights. Haley, you have the next hardball question.
Yes, so we always like to ask our guests and our audience our Great Bake Debate question, which is when we poll a tough question and see what the debate ends up as. So this episode, we are wondering, bagels, do you prefer sweet or savory? That's more like the everything bagel seasoning or more of a cinnamon raisin kind of thing. What do you think, Rebecca?
What about you?
I am absolutely a savory bagel guy. I think the notion of everything bagel seasoning should go on everything.
I would also echo that sentiment. I really like the savory bagels as opposed to the sweet bagels. I'm probably more of a cheese bagel girl.
Like the cheese topping, or just like a plain with cream cheese, or
Cheese topping for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Wow. And then cream cheese as well.
Absolutely. Add as much cheese as we can get in there.
Cheese on both sides.
Yeah, cheese stuffed bagel would be cool.
Oh man, I'm really excited to hear how other people feel, because I know that some people are just really adamant about getting their strawberry cream cheese and their raisin bagels and blueberry bagels and everything. So I look forward to hearing about the Great Bake Debate. But why don't we go ahead and get into the meat of the conversation now? So I want to talk about cannabis as a disruptive ingredient. You know, there are ingredients that come around, you know, we've ABA has run panels on all sorts of ingredients like cricket flour and all of these things. And so the way that I'm kind of thinking of this is cannabis is a disruptive ingredient across the board. And so why don't we walk through what is cannabis and then how can it be integrated into baked goods? So Rebecca, why don't you start with this one, and then we'll just kind of like go from there.
Sure. So when we're talking about cannabis and baked goods, usually we're talking about a flour component, of course. So taking usually either full flour or all of the bud that comes off of a plant, or the trim, and then converting that or extracting it somehow so that we can introduce it into formulations for baked goods. Specifically for sweetgrass, what we use is a can of butter. So that is going to be, it provides, consumers also an at-home experience that can be as unique as they are. And they can also put a gourmet twist on everyday products. So basically the way can of butter works is we start with the cannabis flour. Of course, the quality of the input is going to dictate the quality of the final product. So, the general thought is gold in, gold out, trash in, trash out. So quality as it applies to can of butter is determined through potency testing. So we go through a process called decarboxylation, which is basically where you heat up the flour to burn off the acid molecule that's attached to the THC molecule. So once that's activated through heat and time, the flour is then measured, tested, and then slow simmered in butter for a proprietary amount of time. And then the butter flour mixture is strained, cooled, and then tested a third time for potency so that it can be used to create baked goods. These are all the lab tests that I'm talking about are all performed by third-party labs, and that's to ensure the product potency. And then it's tested once again after the can of butter has been baked into a cookie or a brownie, for instance, to ensure accurate potency.
And you mentioned Sweetgrass, and I just want to let our audience know that that is one of the brands that LiveWell owns. Is that correct?
That's correct. LiveWell acquired Sweetgrass earlier this year. Sweetgrass has been around for about 10 years. We are also what's considered vertically integrated. So we have our own cannabis cultivation, which is really great because we can directly control those quality inputs that I mentioned previously.
That's great. I mean, that's a really interesting business structure. I'm sure that there are interesting strategies behind that. And Doug, I wanted to hear from you. You've been covering this industry. Could you share with us what you see as the overall market potential and how big is this industry really?
Well, as we saw within the last election cycle, the industry keeps getting bigger all the time. In 2019, the U.S. market, hit around a little over 12 billion. And that number is expected to get closer to a little bit over 16 billion this year. Those estimations might be revised upward a little bit based on the kind of accelerated and exponential nature of this market. But currently, BDSA, which is a market analytics company that has a partnership with IRI, they're estimating that the U.S. cannabis market's going to hit 50 billion by 2025. And within that total, edibles account for currently about 15% of dollar sales. That was in 2020. But we see edibles continuing to grow in their appeal to kind of the mass market, everyday folks who are getting into experimenting with cannabis for the first time, because it seems like a more approachable format, particularly if they're not somebody who typically smokes cigarettes or cigars or things like that. Edibles are very approachable, and something like a cookie is something that everybody recognizes and they understand it. And, historically, cookies are perhaps the original first edible baked good, going back to Alice Tolkis years ago, and in 1954, when she included a recipe in her cookbook, and it really took off from there. But it's a highly lucrative market, and when you're talking about kind of segmenting things down by THC containing products, which is the psychoactive cannabinoid in cannabis, and CBD, which is the non-psychoactive and much more just health-focused cannabinoid. The CBD market has, significant potential, especially once FDA has figured out a pathway to try and get that CBD into food and beverages in a legal way. So we think that it holds just tremendous potential, and a lot of people are hailing cannabis as the new ingredient in the food industry in general.
Can we talk a little bit about CBD versus THC and all of that stuff? Our audience probably is aware of some of the differences, but maybe, Rebecca, you could kind of talk us through what those differences are.
Yeah, so CBD is considered one of the minor cannabinoids, and there are a lot of other ones that are starting to also enter the market, such as CBN. But CBD is added to formulations. We've seen a lot of them this year to create a sleep aid, including CBN as well. It's more of a functional ingredient, I would say, that helps to create an effect-based product as well. So CBD is interesting because now it is legal on a national level, whereas THC is not. However, CBD really doesn't have a lot of regulations behind it at this point nationally. So testing, for instance, doesn't come with a lot of SKUs that you would see in the marketplace today. Whereas any product that's sold through a licensed retailer in Colorado, let's say, for instance, you're going to be guaranteed that it's gone through that triple lab testing process that I mentioned earlier, because that's part of the law. So if you want to be ensured that you are getting accurate potency in your product, I always recommend that people purchase their products directly from a licensed retailer at this point. And again, that's because we've seen a lot of products on the CBD market that have entered recently that just don't have the same testing guidelines or regulations to back them up.
So it's really the Wild West, it sounds like.
It is, yeah. And CBD is a really great component. It's great as an anti-inflammatory. It helps with stress relief. So it definitely plays a really big part. And I've also seen a lot of great ratioed products, 1-to-1 ratio. I always recommend to people. It works really well in topicals as well. Again, it has that anti-inflammatory component, as well as adding the THC to it, which is going to help with pain relief. So, if you suffer from arthritis or even a skin condition such as eczema, those types of 1-to-1 products are going to be really great to target relief for those conditions. Something else that we've seen in CBD has been a lot of beverages have come to market with CBD. And as Doug mentioned before, we're not quite there as far as CBD being legal as an additive for a consumable such as an edible at this point on a national level. And we're talking again about CBD that's being derived from hemp rather than cannabis, because those are two distinctly different laws.
Well, it definitely is something that, I feel like we can't have a conversation about cannabis and baked goods without talking about the regulations. So, as some states are legalizing cannabis production. Could you tell us how you've seen the regulations as both a challenge and as an opportunity to develop products, especially baked goods?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge right now, again, is because there's no national regulatory framework. So essentially, every state that we enter as a multi-state operator, we essentially have to start at ground zero, right? So we have to start a whole new cultivation, set up new labs, everything. And so that's why it's not easy to scale across multiple states because of the upfront capital investment that's required to do so. Also, the regulatory framework is very different from state to state, right? So Colorado has its own set of rules. Michigan has its own set of rules, California. So it's very different. And that is what's difficult to navigate. That's where the real challenges come in. Also, from a marketing perspective, which is what I do, we've had to get very creative. We've come a long way since I entered the industry over a decade ago. Magazines, publications, nobody even talked to us previously. So most of our efforts were in the earned media space because we couldn't get people to take our money for paid media. So, just taking a look at those things. Now what I'm seeing, the trend is that these newer emerging markets are starting to at least follow some of the laws that have already been established in other states. So you're starting to see some of those states kind of mimic what essentially Colorado had set up.
So it sounds like there's, you've had to be nimble, and it sounds like, you're kind of, you have a playbook, but you're rewriting it a little bit with each state. And I'm wondering, what sort of challenges does this like patchwork of state regulations, the challenge for like supply chain and logistics and all of these things? I can imagine that it's kind of hard.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a very robust legal team that reviews every last thing, as well as compliance. So underneath that legal department, also we have a team of compliance officers. So they're the ones that are really educated on what those regulations look like, not only from state to state, but we're talking about these can change even from county to county, municipality to municipality. So you have to be really on top of what your local government will allow. As far as supply chain, in a previous role, I helped expand, of course, across several states. One thing that you take a look at is packaging, for instance. How do you start to streamline the packaging so that it is easier, faster, more efficient to ship across to different affiliates? So, for instance, taking a look at moving away from maybe a box to a Mylar bag that can be flat packed and shipped, and it's a lot cheaper and it takes up less storage space. Also, just your base ingredients, of course, are the only things that are going to be constant from market to market, because again, that input of cannabis or THC is going to have to come from that local market where it's being produced.
And part of the reason you have to reestablish in states one by one is that because you can't move across state lines because of the different regulations. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. So you cannot move THC across state lines at all.
Wow. So yeah, it sounds like you're really navigating a lot of different things going on. And I'm wondering what have you seen, especially with COVID? Maybe Doug, you can answer this first. There's a lot of focus on health right now. Have you seen any increases in consumption of these types of products in recent months?
The pandemic, when early on, the state and federal governments were trying to figure out, how to navigate partial or complete societal shutdowns. The overwhelming majority of U.S. states that have an open cannabis market deemed cannabis an essential business. So as such, they were identifying One, this is a medical need for a lot of people, and that's one aspect that we haven't really talked about yet. Is cannabis is a medical food. It's a medical necessity for so many different people who are dealing with a wide range of different conditions. So. And then the health and wellness aspect of it is also a huge component as well. Rebecca was talking a little bit about the anxiety and stress and depression, sleep help. All of these things are aspects that help soothe people during times of increased stress. And if there's anything we can agree on, is that 2020 has been kind of the poster child for increased stress. Cannabis fits really well into that market. And I think once we've gotten to the point where we've counted up all of the sales for the year, we're going to see that there was a pretty significant increase that will correlate directly to the COVID pandemic that we continue to deal with.
Yeah, and just to add on there, I would say, what we saw here in Colorado with the COVID stay-at-home orders, we saw a 2-week spike as consumers started to stock up not only on cannabis, but toilet paper as well. And then, following that panic spike, we saw a decline as most states began sheltering in place. And then, as Doug mentioned, by the end of March, most states had deemed cannabis as essential, which caused additional spikes in wholesale orders to try and keep up with the demand. For a very short period of time here in Colorado, the governor said that all liquor stores and cannabis dispensaries would be closed. And so you saw massive amounts of people running out to stock up not only on cannabis, but alcohol as well. Later that afternoon, after about 4 hours of that chaos, they decided, we better reverse what we just enacted. And so that's when they deemed it essential. Of course, they made it a little bit more difficult at first. We had to transition and pivot to curbside pickup, which caused a lot of logistical nightmares. And so we were able to eventually open the doors back up for consumers to actually come inside the dispensary. But that was a major challenge. So what we've really seen is a huge shift to e-commerce. So very quickly, all of these retailers had to get online and make order ahead, for instance, is what we use at LiveWell, to make it easier for the consumers to be able to pre-order and then just come by, eliminating some of that foot traffic inside those retail spaces. And then, of course, we saw additional spikes leading up to 420. We see that traditionally. But since then, sales have really stabilized, but of course, at higher volume. So year over year, I think we're at about 40% year over year. So we actually have been pleasantly surprised that we've been pacing the way we have this year, even with the pandemic.
That's intense growth year over year. And I need to ask the question just because we need to talk about the other side of this, cannabis and baked goods and everything. Of course, Rebecca, you're going to say it's great. We're talking here about health benefits and all of these other things, but there's also, a good number of people who have moral issues with cannabis and THC specifically. And then also, the challenges with the federal government and banking and all of these things. So I want to talk about that a little bit. What can you talk about there? Either of you guys?
Well, I think if you want to consider where we are in terms of the alcohol market and the growth and evolution of that market and kind of the back and forth that we've seen there, that is, very much a parallel to what we see in the recreational aspect of cannabis these days. There is a significant level of competition that is emerging between alcohol companies and cannabis companies, and that's why we've seen almost every major alcohol beer company, spirits company, and so forth. All of the major players are investing in cannabis because they see the writing on the wall. They know that this is going to be hugely competitive, and that people are looking for products like alcohol or cannabis at the end of the day to unwind and to relax a little bit. And as we get into more sophisticated ingredient manufacturing, and we start talking about quick liftoff, where like with an alcoholic drink, where you can have a drink and you feel the effects pretty quickly, and then they taper off. And we're getting to the same point in cannabis where we can replicate the same type of experience. Historically, cannabis was largely misunderstood. There have been huge benefits all along for cannabis, and that's why the medical market preceded this. As the medical market was ramping up, they saw a very distinct need for cannabis in society. And, it's an uphill battle. There's some folks who are going to hold on to, the old days of prohibition and those perspectives that have been kind of ingrained in us for years. But every industry has its growing pains, and that's going to be one of them. But as we've seen, as more people get exposed to cannabis, as they learn more about it, they become convinced that it's something that does have a place in our global society. At this point, when you're talking about CBD, we have an estimate from BDSA that says 33% of the U.S. population are current CBD consumers. I mean, that is highly significant. And these are statistics that you can't deny. This is a market that's growing and has such significant upside potential that, I think that most people are going to find that they can reconcile their differences.
Yeah, and just to dovetail about the beverage market, we still don't see very many MSOs in the legal cannabis space outside of California. Most markets only offer 1, 2, maybe 3 brands who are doing beverages at this point. Doug did mention that, there are some products that are now offering more of a rapid onset, but not all of them are. So it also is not as cost effective for heavier users. Generally when you're talking about a heavier user, they're probably using a different method of consumption, whether that be a concentrate or a vape or something else that is going to give them a faster relief. So I think we're just not seeing enough weekend warriors to support scaling production across all markets yet. But again, some are trying to mimic alcohol in that positioning, but a lot of the delayed onset, it just gives the consumers who are used to that type of a rapid onset, it's a little disappointing for them. So I think as the technology improves and we can get closer to that, that's where cannabis will really be a competitor in the beverage space.
Yeah, I'd imagine that even with some of the work that you guys are doing now and some of the products you're producing, you probably have to put almost like a warning label, like don't eat more than 1 cookie at one time. Like,
oh yeah,
it's regular cookies. You can eat like a whole sleeve of Girl Scout Thin Mints, but I can't imagine that you would want to sit down and chow down on a bunch of cookies.
Yeah, generally it's, start low, go slow. Start with a low dose, see how your body reacts, because everybody is different. It's not a one size fits all. A lot of it is dependent on metabolism from what I've seen and studied over the years. But again, you can have 2 very different people have a very different reaction. So you have to know what's right for you and your system and your body and adapt to that.
And we see the same thing in the alcohol market, where some folks, they'll have 1 glass of wine and they'll say, whoa, it really went to my head, and that's it. And that's all they do. And some people, will have 2 or 3 and feel just fine. So, as people start to enter this market and start to experiment with what might work with them, they'll fine tune what works for them. They'll figure out what products work best for them, and what types of environments and setting they enjoy, and it becomes a whole new social opportunity.
And switching gears just a little bit as we start to wind down our conversation, I'm wondering, oftentimes we look to Europe and Asia and different parts of the world at the regulations that they're putting in place regarding ingredients and everything. Where is the rest of the world on cannabis and THC or CBD and kind of all these things? Where's everybody else?
Well, one of the biggest research arms globally for cannabis for years has been Israel. There's some of the top researchers in the market, at least really early on, and continuing to this day, have been based in Israel, and they have a very strong medical market in that country. Other European countries have been adopting medical programs, and we see it only a matter of time before more countries start opening up to the opportunity for cannabis. Of course, our neighbor to the north, Canada, has been a kind of a global pilot study for the rest of the world, as they've opened up nationally, and we've seen how their infrastructure has been established and how they've grown the industry over the last couple of years. So we're seeing how it can work. We're seeing how cannabis can be federally legal and how it can fit into a national economy in a way that's highly supportive and beneficial for all involved.
Thanks, Doug, for that, walking us through that. I also have two questions. The first is where, there's a lot of education that has to go on with cannabis and products, and there's also a lot of R&D and research. Where do you see, Rebecca, as the biggest place that you want to invest in within your company? Is it on the education side, educating consumers? Is it developing new products? Is it innovating? Where do you see that?
Well, it's definitely a combination, but education is always paramount. And it's more about educating the people who are on the front line. So, in my opinion, bud tenders are some of the absolute most influential people in this industry because they call the shots at the point of sale. So ensuring that they're educated about the products and passing that knowledge along to consumers is essential. So what we've done, Livewell actually owns a third-party learning management system called Learn Brands, and that affords us an opportunity to be able to upload modules onto a site, and bud tenders can take those educational courses along with quizzes. And once they pass the quiz satisfactorily, they can actually get a certificate to redeem a product inside the retailer. So we're seeing that as a way to educate the masses, also get a product into their hands so they can actually try it firsthand. And then also we afford an opportunity for them to provide us feedback. And that feedback is invaluable. It's how we take a look at product line extensions. Maybe there's a product that needs to be sunset. So it really does give us a ton of information. And again, I think it really starts inside the dispensary at this point.
And you were talking about product. What are some of the products that you see with the highest growth trajectory, maybe both in general and just within the baked goods segment?
Yeah, I think it actually depends on what state you're looking at. It's all very different. So, the top three categories, for instance, in Colorado are going to be cartridges, concentrates, followed by disposable vape pens, with the fastest growing category being pre-rolls. If you take a look at Michigan, their top three are going to be cartridges, flour, followed by edibles, with the fastest growing category being cartridges. So again, it just depends on what state you're looking at. Of course, Colorado is a mature state at this point in comparison to other emerging markets. Some of those emerging markets can be messy, and also just not have as many options for consumers. So a consumer may be purchasing something because that's really all there is at this time in that specific location. So it's interesting to see the demographics and how they change and how the behavior changes along with it.
What are some of those demographic changes?
I think in Colorado, people here have active lifestyles. That's why people move here to go up to the mountains and do outdoor activities. So people are looking for products that can live up to that lifestyle. So it's something that they can take with them on the go. Maybe it's something that's a little bit more discreet. Whereas if you look at a different state, that's maybe not as active, maybe they're more used to using more elaborate apparatus or paraphernalia, such as a concentrate rig or something like that, where it's really not something that is portable.
I guess what I'm wondering is too, from like an age standpoint, like where do you is this a bunch of like millennials and Gen Z kids, like are the main consumers of your products, or are they starting to trend older, or kind of what are you seeing?
Yeah, it depends completely on the product category. When we're talking about concentrates, that's definitely a younger consumer, probably skews more male. When we're talking about baked goods, that demographic actually is a little bit older. We're probably talking 35 plus that are looking at those. And also, I think it has to do, it's a direct correlation of price per milligram, right? There's a lot more that goes into making an edible. Therefore, the price per milligram is generally going to be more expensive than if you were to buy flour, for instance. But what we see is flour is still king across all markets. So it's probably going to stay that way for some time, where we're seeing, sales of flour probably makes up close to 50%, if not more, of most market sales. Whereas baked goods is actually a very, very, very small percentage of the overall market in general. Baked goods sales as a category is a small slice with maybe 3% year-to-date distribution. So if you're putting that into perspective, that's barely a quarter of the candy category, whereas gummies really reign king when it comes to candies. However, baked goods we've seen gain about 1% this year, which is a 40% increase overall, which is big growth, but again, still a very small subsection of the entire market.
That's super interesting. And, as I think about what you both were saying about the health benefits and how people might be turning to cannabis products for those health benefits, are we going to see any type of, healthy brownie, or like in terms of the actual nutritional benefits? Like, are we going to see any sourdough edibles kind of thing?
Yeah, I don't see a ton of savory edibles still. Most edibles come in a sweet form factor. We're talking chocolates, cookies, brownies, gummies, hard candies, things of that nature. Don't see a ton of savory options, which is interesting to me. I think that if we started to bring maybe even a hot sauce to market, let's say, for instance, something that can easily integrate into somebody's lifestyle already, then maybe we can see that category start to grow. But that does present a challenge as well, right? A lot of these sweeter options in my mind are more occasional. You probably aren't going to chow down a full chocolate bar every day to get your THC or CBD. You're probably going to look for something that's a little bit healthier. So these products are being purchased, I think, when people are celebrating a special occasion, maybe an anniversary or a birthday or a holiday, something like that. But we are starting to see a lot more healthy options. So, vegan, gluten-free, sugar-free, maybe baked goods. Some manufacturers even looking at using coconut oil, infusing that as opposed to butter for a vegan option.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. As you guys say, like health, people are looking at the health benefits, maybe eating a product that's slightly healthier. And so just to wrap up, is there anything else that you, Rebecca, or you, Doug, want to share with our audience that you want them to know before we hang up today?
Well, I would say that the biggest takeaway for me is that this is, while it's already a lucrative market, it's very much an emerging market. And as a result, we're still figuring out the demographics. We're still figuring out how everyday U.S. consumers, perhaps who are not cannabis consumers before legalization, are going to approach the products. And as a result, I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation with different diverse product formats. We are going to see more growth in kind of the microdose area, where it's these very small, very manageable doses that people can begin with to try and get an idea of how cannabis fits into their life. We're going to see a lot of experimentation in that area. And as a result, this is going to be a really fun market to watch over the next few years as we see its exponential growth across the country as more markets open up and more states bring this market into their economy.
Yeah, I agree. I think consumers are looking for alternative ways to consume cannabis beyond just combustibles. And we've seen that even this year where edibles have gained popularity during COVID. We've seen a spike in the consumption of edibles and other infused products. And Doug makes a great point about microdosing. Those products are imperative to be able to get other consumers or other segments or demographics to adopt cannabis use. I see older demographic really looking for that lower dose. We're thinking, around 2.5 milligrams, let's say, that really just takes the edge off and relieves stress, but doesn't necessarily alter you to the point where you are not functioning.
Thank you for all of that information. Lots of good data to chew on and think about and consider. And I look forward to talking to our regulatory person at ABA. And before we hang up, I am wondering, Rebecca, is this something that you want to see as federally regulated?
Yeah, I do. I think we need to be really careful as we get closer to that, though. We don't want big pharma to take it over and then cut everybody else out. I think, that's been the fear among operators since the beginning. So we just need to be really strategic and very careful as we start to legalize and end prohibition. There have been some major things that have happened recently with the MORE Act and also the Medical Marijuana Research Act here recently in the U.S., which is great. The MORE Act is going to repeal cannabis prohibition, and it would remove marijuana from the list of scheduled substances under the Controlled Substance Act. It'll also eliminate criminal penalties for manufacturing, distribution, and possession. There's also a line item in there to expunge low-level marijuana convictions, which we've already started to see that in legal states. It would also block federal agencies from denying public benefits or security clearances due to cannabis use, also allowing veterans or the VA physicians to recommend medical cannabis. So I think that we're headed in the right direction for sure, but we just need to make sure that the people who have been the trailblazers and made the sacrifices for this industry to be what it is today aren't cut out once those changes occur.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Doug, for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's been my pleasure.
And now we have with us Rasmus Voners, ABA's Vice President of Regulatory and Technical Services, to talk with us about the regulatory outlook of baking and cannabis at the state and federal level, and some things companies should consider when getting into this business. Welcome, Rasmus.
Thank you. I'm so glad that had an opportunity to join you today.
When we talk about cannabis and baking and CBD and THC and all of the letters that were mentioned earlier on in the podcast, do we think about those as just other ingredients, or is it FDA, USDA, kind of like where is the regulation here? Is it another ingredient that they just go through a process on?
So I think it may be helpful to just sort of step back from the federal level and sort of look at it more holistically and kind of who is regulating what. So you actually have a lot of different entities that are engaging. You have the Drug Enforcement Administration that looks at it from the marijuana perspective. You have the USDA, who issued the Farm Bill that allows hemp to be grown and used for production for CBD. And then you have FDA, who looks at the things that are regulated as drugs and also food. And then on top of that, which our prior guests certainly touched on, is the states. And in some cases, you also have localities that have different regulations. So if you look at it, I mean, it's kind of layer upon layer upon layer. So it is a quagmire, and there are a lot of different moving parts. And if you look at the state level, it's within each state, and I'm not going to go through the prior presentation that the talking points, but it very much is. It's very challenging. Regulated within the state, you can't have products, edibles cross state lines. Each state has slightly different requirements. Some have been at this a little bit longer and have more rigorous programs. So it's a wide array of what is expected. And then when you take it up to the federal level, there is no streamlined platform from a regulatory perspective.
So we know that some of the states are looking to or have already legalized recreational use of cannabis. Are you seeing more states coming down the pipeline potentially to legalize it? And what might that mean for the federal level?
I would say yes, that the states, you see a continued increase in the debate and the willingness to move forward with CBD. And I think this is my opinion, but what we may see come to fruition is something similar to what we have had in other FDA and USDA regulated programs. So in particular, I'm thinking about streamlining how different states deal with bioengineered ingredients, where you had states that were sort of mushrooming, taking different approaches, and then you had congressional action step in and say, let's create a level playing field so that everyone is working with the same sorts of labeling. I don't expect Congress to necessarily step in, but I do think the more that states take on different programs that do not mirror one another, there will be a greater incentive to push FDA to move forward with this. And I'm not implying that FDA isn't moving forward with it. I just think that their pace has been very slow.
And how does that happen? How does that groundswell happen?
Well, I think, obviously there are a lot of things, so let's back up and talk a little bit about what's happening, at FDA. Currently, CBD cannot be used or sold as a dietary supplement or as a food ingredient. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have the other, the medicinals and things that our prior guests were talking about, but on the federal level, they do not have that granted authority. I do feel that with some of the activity that's taking place in this space, you may see more action in a shorter timeline along the dietary supplement route than you would necessarily in food. And here's the reason why. So you have a couple of things that are working here. Congress some time ago indicated that the FDA had to come out with an enforcement discretion policy regarding CBD. And that is currently at the Office of Management and Budget going through internal review. The broader food sector has not had an opportunity to see what is in that enforcement discretion guidance, but we do suspect that it will likely focus more on supplements and vitamins versus actual food. And the piece there is that it's far easier to look at, say, a vitamin that has a CBD content and specify what level is acceptable. Last year through our Food Beverage Issue Alliance, we had an opportunity to sit down with FDA and ask them where they were headed with this. And one of the biggest concerns that they have is what is sort of that holistic impact on an individual. And that's what they need to look at both from a food ingredient perspective as well as a dietary supplement. So if you think about the person may wake up in the morning and add some CBD to your coffee, and then you're going to go take a quick shower and you're going to put on some CBD lotion. Then at lunch, you may add an edible, into your diet. Further along in the day, some arthritic pains creep up. You may add some more CBD, and they just don't have a good assessment and have to move forward with caution on how all of that together could have a potential impact on a human. They also need to look at, different types of populations. Is it, young, old, people that may have certain health ailments and so forth. So it's a more holistic approach, and they're taking their time to get there. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
And you mentioned CBD the whole time there. Is it a similar process for THC?
THC would be different. That would be something that's strictly looked at as on the drug side. The conversations have been more about adding CBD to food at this point versus the THC. Now, I will say that one of the other cautions that FDA has identified in conversations with the broader food sector is many of the ingredients and many of the items that you can purchase and that they randomly take and sample may not always have the ingredients that they claim to have. So there's also a safety concern there. So you may purchase something that you think is just THC, or you may purchase something that has just CBD, but they're finding that not in all cases the ingredients match the label. So I think, again, caution from a regulatory perspective.
It sounds like there's a lot to think about. And, even just talking to Rebecca, hearing her dive into what she is thinking about in terms of like products and trends and things like that. And, regulation is the number one thing, it seems like, on their minds as they're developing new products, as they're developing packaging and, trying to expand their business and their supply chain. It seems just very top of mind.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, just also a little bit of background on where FDA is, they do have an internal working group that is looking at how do you move forward with CBD, They have, in 2019, they actually held a public meeting on the topic and received, I believe it was over 4,000 some public comments that they then have to sort through. So it's not as if they're not moving forward. But I think, before we can include this in, say, a typical baked process, you actually do have to apply for a generally recognized as safe notice, it's called GRAS, no pun intended. But it is a process that you submit information to FDA and then they assess going through the information in the process and then make the determination that that is a safe product or an ingredient that can be added to a food. I do understand anecdotally that several petitions or information have been submitted to FDA. There's nothing that has been publicly stated or is publicly available for others to look at this time. But I do feel that from the hemp seed community that there is certainly ongoing dialogue with FDA. I also think that they feel strongly that, there's a desire to have a more level playing field or at least a streamlined approach.
And so is this an issue that ABA is working on or tracking, or kind of where do we fit into all this?
ABA at this point is tracking the issue. I anticipate that if there's more regulatory clarity that comes around, that we will certainly engage at a different level. I have had the opportunity to informally participate in a couple of different coalitions that are looking at this issue more closely. And I think it's just a matter of time before ABA takes the dive and, engages in some of these sectors a little more actively.
I get it. It'll all depend on our members' needs and kind of where we go from there then.
Absolutely.
All right, Rasma, thank you so much for joining us today. It was good to get your perspective on everything. I'm sure if we have more questions as we continue to move on this topic and just learn more about it, I know that your insight will be very much appreciated, not only by us, but by our members.
Thank you. It's been a great opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining us, and I want to let our listeners know that you can find more episodes at baketothefuture.org, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon Music, or Ghana, and take the Great Bake Debate at baketothefuture.org/debate.
Bake to the Future is brought to you by the American Bakers Association in partnership with Human Factor. To hear upcoming and past episodes, go to baketothefuture.org. Bake to the Future is produced by Haley Blumenreich. Audio engineer is Blake Alton. And A Slice of the Action is written by the American Bakers Association's Government Relations team.